The ship lurched again, and you felt your stomach heave. You'd lost count of how many times you'd vomited in the past 6 weeks. There was nothing left in your stomach, just bile burning your throat. You were crammed into the hold with 200 other passengers, so tightly packed you couldn't lie down flat. The air was thick with the smell of vomit, sewage, and unwashed bodies. The man next to you had died 3 days ago. His body was still there, wedged against you, because they only removed corpses when they came to distribute the meager rations. You were 9 years old. Your parents had sold everything they owned for passage to America. They told you stories about land and opportunity and a better life. They hadn't told you about this. About the darkness and the stench and the constant fear that you'd be next to die. Above you, you could hear the crew moving around. They had light, fresh air, proper food. Below deck in the cargo hold where the poor passengers were stored, you had nothing. Just the certainty that if this voyage didn't end soon, you wouldn't survive to see the new world everyone kept promising was worth this suffering. The ship hit another wave. Someone screamed. And you closed your eyes and prayed for death or land, whichever came first. The 16 and 1700s saw hundreds of thousands of Europeans cross the Atlantic to colonial America. The stories told about these journeys focus on bravery and adventure and the pioneering spirit. What they don't talk about is the death rate. The voyages typically lasted 6 to 12 weeks depending on weather and route. Conditions on the ships varied dramatically based on how much you could pay. Wealthy passengers had cabins, real food, access to fresh air. Poor passengers, which was most of them, were packed into the hold like cargo. Whole families crammed into spaces barely large enough to lie down. No privacy, no sanitation, no ventilation. You brought what food you could afford, and when it ran out, you survived on ship's rations that were often rotten. Water was stored in barrels that grew algae and turned foul. Disease spread instantly in the cramped, filthy conditions. Typhus, dysentery, scurvy, smallpox. Once someone got sick, everyone got sick. Bodies were thrown overboard almost daily on some voyages. Ship captains kept death counts in their logs like accounting ledgers. 20 died this week, 30 the next. The bodies went into the ocean, and the voyage continued. Some ships lost half their passengers before reaching land, and the survivors arrived so weakened by the journey that many died within weeks of landing. Sarah Whitmore was 9 when her family boarded a ship bound for Virginia in 1658. Her father was a tenant farmer in England who'd lost his land when the owner decided to raise sheep instead of renting to farmers. With no land and no prospects, he'd signed an indenture contract. The family would get passage to America, and in exchange, he'd work for 7 years for whoever bought his contract when they landed. Sarah, her parents, and her 2 younger brothers were assigned space in the hold. A section maybe 6 feet by 4 feet for all 5 of them. They brought dried meat, hard biscuits, and a small barrel of water. They thought it would be enough for the 6-week voyage. It was. The voyage took 11 weeks. Storms pushed them off course. The ship was damaged and had to make repairs. By week 7, Sarah's family had run out of food. They relied on ship's rations, moldy biscuits, salted meat that was more maggot than meat, water so foul you could barely choke it down. Sarah's younger brother, only 4 years old, got sick in week 8, fever and diarrhea. He couldn't keep anything down. Their mother held him, tried to get him to drink water, but he was too weak. He died in week 9. They wrapped his small body in a cloth and brought him up to the deck. A crewman took him without ceremony and threw him overboard. No prayer, no moment of silence, just another body in the ocean. Sarah watched her brother disappear into the waves and felt something inside her die too. The ship finally reached Virginia in week 11. Of the 200 passengers who'd boarded in England, 143 were still alive. 57 had died during the crossing. The survivors stumbled off the ship into a world that bore no resemblance to what they'd been promised. Jamestown was a struggling settlement barely holding on. The land wasn't the fertile paradise described by recruiters. It was swamp and forest that would take brutal labor to clear. The climate was hot and humid, breeding mosquitoes that carried malaria, and the settlers who'd arrived before weren't thriving. They were dying from disease, starvation, and conflict with the native population who didn't appreciate having their land stolen. Sarah's family was taken immediately to the auction block. That's what it was called. They stood there while colonists who'd paid for the voyage examined them like livestock, checked their teeth, their muscle tone, their health. Sarah's father was bought by a tobacco planter. Her mother was bought by the same man. Sarah and her surviving brother were separated and bought by different families. Sarah screamed and tried to hold on to her mother. A man pulled her away. Her mother was crying, reaching for her. The buyer told Sarah to be quiet or he'd beat her. She was 9 years old and she'd just lost her entire family. This was the new world. This was opportunity. Sarah's buyer took her to his farm 20 miles inland. She was put to work immediately. Her job was helping in the house and the fields, cooking, cleaning, hauling water, weeding, harvesting. She worked from before dawn until after dark, 7 days a week. The work was backbreaking. Sarah was too small for most of the tasks, but that didn't matter. If you couldn't do it, you were beaten until you found a way. The farmer's wife was cruel. She'd hit Sarah with whatever was handy, a wooden spoon, a belt, her fists. Sarah learned quickly not to cry. Crying made it worse. She learned to move fast, work hard, and make herself invisible. Conditions were brutal. The cabin she slept in had no windows, no ventilation. In summer, it was like an oven. In winter, it was freezing because there was no heat. She had one dress, worn and thin, and no shoes. Her feet were constantly cut and infected from walking on rough ground. The food was minimal, cornmeal mush. Sometimes dried beans, rarely meat, never enough. Sarah was always hungry. Her body didn't grow properly. By the time she was 12, she looked 8, malnourished and stunted. If you were Sarah, 9 years old and torn from your family, working yourself to exhaustion every day for people who beat you, living in conditions barely better than the ship you survived, would you have kept hoping things would improve? Or would you have realized that this was all your life would ever be? Disease in the colonies killed constantly. Malaria, dysentery, typhoid, yellow fever. The death rate in early Virginia was staggering. Nearly half of new arrivals died within their first year. The combination of unfamiliar diseases, inadequate food, brutal working conditions, and a complete lack of medical care meant people dropped like flies. Sarah watched indentured servants die regularly. They'd get sick, become too weak to work, and within days or weeks they were dead, buried in unmarked graves on the edge of the property. The planter would just buy or contract for new servants to replace them. People were commodities, expendable resources. Sarah got malaria her second year in Virginia. She'd lie in her cabin shaking with fever, then burning up, then freezing again. The cycle repeated for days. No one gave her medicine. No one checked on her. She either survived or she didn't. She survived, but the malaria came back, again and again. Every few months the fever would return. It weakened her permanently, left her tired all the time, unable to do the same work she'd been able to do before. The farmer's wife beat her for being lazy, called her worthless, threatened to sell her contract to someone worse. But here's what makes the colonial settler experience even more horrific. Everything about it was a lie. The recruiters in England painted pictures of abundance and opportunity, land for everyone, fertile soil, prosperity. What they didn't mention was that the land belonged to indigenous peoples who were being systematically displaced and murdered. They didn't mention the death rates. They didn't mention that indentured servitude was barely distinguishable from slavery. They didn't mention that the climate bred disease. They didn't mention that most settlers died poor and broken. The colonial project was built on lies told to desperate people. People like Sarah's father who had nothing left in England and believed the promises. And when those people arrived and found the reality, they were trapped, couldn't afford passage back, were legally bound to their contracts, had nowhere to go and no way to escape. They'd been lured to America and then abandoned to suffer and die for the profit of the planters and merchants who'd brought them there. The whole system was designed to exploit them, use their labor, use their bodies, and when they were used up, replace them with new immigrants who'd been fed the same lies. Think about the mythology of American settlers. brave pioneers building a new nation. The American dream. Now think about Sarah. A child torn from her family, worked to the point of collapse, beaten regularly, starving and sick with no hope of anything better. That was the reality for thousands. Would you celebrate that? Would you call it opportunity? Or would you see it for what it was, organized exploitation on a massive scale? Most indentured servants didn't survive their contracts. 7 years was a long time when you were being worked to death, underfed, and exposed to constant disease. Sarah lasted 5 years. By the time she was 14, her body was failing. The repeated bouts of malaria had damaged her. The malnutrition had stunted her growth and weakened her bones. The brutal labor had destroyed her back and joints. She could barely walk some days. The pain was constant, and she knew she was dying. She could feel her body shutting down. One morning, she couldn't get up. Her legs wouldn't hold her. The farmer's wife came to drag her out of bed for work and found her on the floor. Sarah couldn't stand, couldn't move. The woman called her lazy, told her she'd be beaten if she didn't get up. Sarah tried. She couldn't. Her body was done. The farmer was called. He looked at Sarah like she was a broken tool, worthless now. He had her moved to a shed at the back of the property, out of sight, left there with no food or water. Sarah lay on the dirt floor alone and waited to die. It took 3 days. 3 days of lying in that shed, her body slowly shutting down, no one checking on her, no one caring. She thought about her family, her mother, her brothers, her father. She wondered if they were still alive, if they'd suffered as much as she had. She thought about England, about the life she'd had before they'd left. It hadn't been good, but it had been better than this. She thought about all the promises, the new world, opportunity, a better life, all lies, all designed to lure people like her family into this hell. Sarah died alone in that shed. She was 14 years old. Her body was left there for 2 days before someone finally dragged it out and buried it in an unmarked hole. No ceremony, no marker, no record beyond a note in the farmer's ledger that his indentured servant had died and he'd need to acquire a replacement. Sarah's parents never learned what happened to her. They died within 3 years of arriving, both from disease. Her brothers had been separated and lost to the system. The entire Whitmore family had been consumed by the colonial machine, every one of them dead before any of them could see the freedom they'd been promised. The colonies grew and prospered. More ships arrived with more desperate immigrants. More contracts were signed. More people were worked to death in tobacco fields and rice plantations. The wealth generated by their labor built cities, funded businesses, created fortunes for the landowners. And the people who did the actual work, who broke their bodies and died young, they were erased from the story. History remembers the successful planters, the founding fathers, the brave pioneers. It doesn't remember the Sarah Whitmores, the children torn from families, the servants worked to death, the thousands of bodies buried in unmarked graves. Their suffering built America. Their labor created the foundation of colonial prosperity, and they got nothing, not even the dignity of being remembered. Even after indentured servitude was eventually phased out, the same patterns continued. New immigrant groups were exploited. New systems of labor extraction were created. The American dream was always based on someone else's nightmare, on people desperate enough to believe the lies, willing to sacrifice everything for a chance that rarely materialized. Sarah died believing she'd somehow failed, that if she'd been stronger, worked harder, endured better, things would have turned out differently. But the system was designed for her to fail, designed to extract every ounce of labor from her body and then discard her when she was used up. She never had a chance. None of them did. And the people who profited from their suffering never faced consequences, never acknowledged the cost, never admitted that their prosperity was built on bodies of children like Sarah. The colonial American experience wasn't about freedom or opportunity or pioneering spirit. It was about exploitation, about powerful people using desperate people until they died, about lies told to lure victims, about suffering hidden under mythology. Sarah's story is the real story of colonial America, and it's a story we still don't want to tell, Because telling it means confronting the fact that the foundation of this country was built on the broken bodies of people who were promised everything and given nothing but suffering and early death. That's the truth. That's what settlement really meant. And until we acknowledge that, until we stop romanticizing the past and face what it actually was, we'll keep repeating the same patterns. Keep exploiting the desperate. Keep telling lies to people who have no other options. Keep building prosperity on suffering and calling it progress.